Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrell, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by ACE, the HR Exam, and Upskill HR. These are two of the courses that we offer for certification prep and recertification for HR leaders. You can learn more about these courses at Workology.com. This podcast is part of a new series that I'm calling HR Basics. It's where we cover common yet complex topics within the world of human resources. And for the HR Basics series, I'm tapping into the HR consultant brain trust to guide us in these very complex topics within the field of HR. In every single episode of the HR Basics series, we're going to talk to a different HR consultant who supports multiple clients and customers. They provide consulting, advising, and other support services for businesses of all sizes and industries. In this episode, we're tackling the topic of employee relations and toxic workplaces. Two things that just do not go together. Employees are more likely to collaborate effectively and contribute creative ideas when they feel secure and respected in their workplace. On the contrary, poor employee relations can lead to lower job satisfaction, increased stress, and reduced loyalty to the organization, significantly lowering overall productivity. When you throw a stressful work environment into the mix, you get a toxic workplace, which can have detrimental effects on employee well-being, such as burnout, stress, depression, and anxiety. Chronic stress from workplace abuse can lead to physical illnesses like heart disease, cancer, and other illnesses. Our job as HR professionals, we should be able to help resolve these issues like harassment, discrimination, and other safety concerns, because they can directly impact the workplace culture. Now, before I introduce our guest for today, I do want to hear from you. Please comment podcast on the pinned post on my Instagram account at Workology Blog. You can ask questions, leave comments, and make suggestions for future guests. I do want to hear from you. Feedback is a gift. Today's guest is Naomi Siegel, SHRM-CP professional and HR consultant. She's currently the HR manager for the Levy Group and consultant for various organizations. Naomi has been in HR leadership for over a decade and has a really interesting background that also involves theater and fashion. Naomi assisted the New York City Production Managers Forum's HR and hiring subcommittees in publishing a recommendation of new standards for working in NYC production. I'm so excited and honored to welcome Naomi to the Workology Podcast.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's so wonderful to be here.
I am really looking forward to this conversation. Our prep call was amazing. So talk to us a little bit about your background and what led you to HR consulting.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was about 12 years ago, coming out of college, and was kind of in that in-between stage of, I think I know what I want to do, but I'm not quite ready to get there. And so I was looking for really some temporary work. I was a theater kid growing up, you know, one of the kids, terrible actress, but loved being up on stage. And so when I got the opportunity to work for a scene shop, I really took it and ran with it. They were looking for somebody who was more of an assistant type to help with in the finance department, but with the HR stuff. And so I got there. I really loved the vibe, knowing what they were creating, wanting to be a part of it. I got in there and I said, anything you are willing to teach me, I am willing to learn. And that really kickstarted my journey. In my 6 years there, I was trained to take over all HR functions. That's where I studied and received my first HR certification. And unfortunately, it was a little bit of a small office, so there wasn't a ton of room for growth. So I then took my skills and figured that I wanted to stay within the theater industry. What I had learned in my time was that there's not a whole lot of HR in theater. Um, and a lot of that has to do with company sizes, which we will get to. Um, so I found myself a position in a company that was growing and was at the point where they needed in-house HR. So I started and created their HR department, worked that all up, got it set and going for them to hand off to another HR professional while I found my next opportunity. And I did that a couple times, and it was within that space that I really saw an opening and availability, really a need for consulting within that industry. A lot of the companies are very small, very new. It just really wasn't cost effective to have in-house HR, and a lot of it was word of mouth. It was, a couple people opening up a new company for themselves every year and talking to their friends about what they needed to do and all of that. And I took that as my opportunity to say, hey, if you're going to start a company, we're going to do it right from the beginning. And that really blossomed the consulting aspect of my work. From there, continued more word of mouth for companies that were existing but needed help, and doing a lot more in that sphere. I had full-time jobs within that, and I was working for a theater startup that unfortunately didn't succeed when I was looking for my next opportunity, and happened to land in a fashion company, which was a complete turn for me, but has been really interesting and helpful as I'm talking to new companies, different companies, companies of different sizes. So within the last 12 years, I've really had the opportunity to do HR in a number of different size organizations, different types of companies, really get the full picture.
I find this fascinating as an entrepreneur. Like, you found this really interesting niche that, and experts always say like niching is really important, but you've really taken this to, like, I think, a really specific level. And what's great is, as you said, like, word of mouth. Like, you don't have to do a lot of business development in the same way that maybe other HR consultants have to do. I was talking to someone the other day, and they were talking about how, like, LinkedIn is really effective for them. And your
Yeah.
strategy, I'm assuming, would be a little bit different, but it's really targeted. So you know exactly who your ideal clients would be.
Absolutely. And, the fact that you bring in LinkedIn is an interesting point, because that, especially within the last 5 years, has really boomed for the place where professionals are connecting with each other. You're finding jobs, you're finding candidates, and all of those things. The theater world, at least in New York, which is where I have my expertise, doesn't really use LinkedIn. You will find some companies on there. There are, some really big names in the industry who are sharing their experience. I suggest everybody to go follow Kent Davenport. But in terms of companies looking for their staff, it doesn't really happen on LinkedIn.
Super fascinating. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what your approach is to consulting and how you work a little bit more with business leaders, because it sounds like you're coming in and building this thing, like, from the ground up, and then as a consultant you're handing it off in some cases to an in-house person. Is that kind of how it works for you?
Yeah. So I can be brought in kind of two ways. The first one is, from the beginning, we're working on policy creation, building the foundation for a successful company culture. And then there are other times when I am brought in after the fact. Either there's an issue that is happening and they've realized that they don't have a policy to address it, or they need a third party mediator to come in and really handle what's going on there, which happens fairly often when you have companies that are 5 people or less. It can be difficult to handle those issues in-house. But my approach is really I take the leader, whoever's either in charge of hiring me for the project or in charge of the company, and I ask them what they feel like their immediate needs are. Those are the first things that we're going to address. And then from there, I can expand on those and say, once we're done with this, let's talk about the next stage of the project. That happens a lot when it comes to policy creation. A lot of it is, hey, I don't have a handbook. I really need a handbook. That's my number one priority. And that's a great opportunity because, that's where all of our policies live. And a lot of people don't assume that you can tailor these policies to the company, to the work that you're doing, make it more beneficial for your staff, make certain policies like paid vacation and things that you can attract staff. And so that really opens the door for us to really lay the groundwork and say, what kind of company are you trying to build? How do we use these policies to support that?
I love that. And I will say that you're in New York City, which I feel like when it comes to employment law and like unique approaches or experiences, it's very different. I mean, outside of, I would say, New Jersey and California, like there's a lot of
Absolutely.
specific things that are going on. So they really do need an expert to help them navigate that, regardless of the size of the company.
Absolutely. And, HR in general, on the federal level, there have been a lot of new laws and laws changing within the last 10 years or so. And then, especially as you mentioned, California is a really big one, and New York City really has some specific laws. And if you're not tuned into that, but you've been in business or been working for 30 years, you would think, oh, well, this is what I used to do. This must be still the same thing. And so it really is beneficial where even if you're not working with somebody on policy creation, to really make sure that you are staying in touch with that world and HR policies in some way.
Absolutely, because things I feel like are changing all the time, all the time.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and jump into one of the most challenging things that we do as HR professionals. And that, in my mind, is employee relations. Talk to me
Mm-hmm.
about what your approach is as somebody maybe who's coming in and consulting with an organization in this area.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. That is incredibly tough when you have people who have different personalities, different levels of understanding and empathy, different mental health issues. There are so many things from outside of work that can contribute to employee relation issues. When I'm brought in as a consultant, my very first step is to speak individually with each person involved. There's no way that I can truly know what the issue is or suggest ways to solve it without having the full picture. And, everyone likes to think of that as he said, she said kind of deal, but really, everybody has their own truth in their perspective, and that can fill in a lot of the gaps. So once I have that full perspective, I will then speak with the person who did bring me in and say, this is what I see. These are the options that I know from my experience have the, potential to move things forward in a possible direction. What is it that you would like me to do here? A lot of times the smaller companies are looking for a mediator, somebody to sit with, 2, 3 people who are having issues and facilitate a healthy conversation. In other times, I have had people who have just said, nope, just write everything down that I should be doing, give it to me, and we'll handle it in-house. Neither of those are really wrong. It's just a matter of really how involved they want me and how involved they are with their own employees.
I was just thinking as you were chatting about me working in retail, which my background is very different than yours, but I think that's what makes HR so exciting and interesting. And when I would get assigned to a new store location that I was responsible for, no one would really know who I was. So I would spend as much time as I could before I was found out, and I would just sit in the break room. I would have a newspaper,
Mm-hmm.
a magazine or something or a book, and I would just sit there and read and, kind of like go in and out and like I was on break or whatever. But I would learn so much about what was going on, what some of the challenges were, how people really thought about the store manager and the leadership team. And then eventually somebody would say, do you need some help? You've been in the break room for a while. Can I help you find something? I'm like, oh no, I'm good. I'm your new HR manager. And then word would get out that I'd been sitting in the break room for the last 3 days. But I knew where all the bodies were buried and all the secrets. I knew like what the true thought process was and like what the pulse was for the culture before I moved forward. So it was, I think, a less formalized in a process, but like just a way for us to understand what was really happening in the locations or at the companies that we're providing a resource for. So
Absolutely. And sometimes it can be difficult to do that if there isn't really like a central location. A lot of corporate offices do have a lunchroom or a break room, but sometimes people don't really use those. What I've always tried to do in those kinds of spaces is really make myself available to the staff. I'm not an HR person that sits in my office all of the time. I will go up to somebody and ask, hey, what are you working on? Show me what it is you do, because a lot of times I'm also walking into a space and I don't know the specifics of what each role does. Walking into fashion for the first time, it was, I don't know what any of these terms mean. I don't know what you're doing. Fill me in on that stuff and create a relationship where people are comfortable talking to you. That trust is so important.
I love that. Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller-Merrell, and you are listening to the Workology podcast powered by ACE the HR exam and Upskill HR. We're talking today with Naomi Siegel, certified HR professional and consultant. Comment the word podcast on my pinned Instagram post. You can head on over to @Workology blog, ask me questions, leave comments, and make suggestions for future podcast guests. I do want to hear from you. Now, you can listen to the full version of this podcast episode. It's actually an hour long. It's part of our Upskill HR programming, and it's exclusively available to HR members of Upskill HR. It's an hour-long conversation worth 1 HRCI and SHRM recertification credits over at upskillhr.com. Let's talk about maybe the other side of the coin a little bit here as it relates to employee relations, and that is toxic workplaces. What does that mean to you? I think a lot of people throw that word around. It's a buzzword, it's in the media, but what in your mind is a toxic workplace? What does that look like?
Yeah. So in my mind, a toxic workplace is a company that runs on hostility, somewhere where employees don't feel supported or safe. And that can be, there's a lot of anger, coming down from leadership. It could be that leaders aren't taking accountability. It could just be, a lack of that HR relation functions where there have been so many employee relation issues that aren't being solved, that they are building on top of each other. But really anywhere that, a significant or even not a significant, anywhere where any employee feels unsafe within their company is a toxic workplace.
I like the simplicity of it and the safety component, because when we think of a toxic workplace, at least I've seen in the media, it's not necessarily defined that way, but I think when you get into conversations with employees and people to try to understand why they feel a certain way or what's going on in the organization, the safety component, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like that bottom tier is not being met.
Absolutely. I always say that there's a fine line, but a significant difference between when you wake up in the morning and you don't want to get out of bed because you don't want to get out of bed versus I don't want to get out of bed because I don't want to go into work today, because I don't want to be there. I don't want to have that experience. I don't want to put myself in that situation. Once we hit that point, that's when things start to fall apart.
And I think as HR professionals, we can relate to that, because since we see things from a unique lens, we've probably all been in that place. At least I have, where
Oh
I
yeah.
get up in the morning and I'm like, ooh, I really, really, really don't want to go to the office today. And it's because I know what's coming, or I'm going to have
Yeah.
to interact with somebody who I've been experiencing a lot of conflict with and is making me feel a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I've definitely been there. Sometimes it's a conflict. Sometimes it's you're predicting a conflict is coming. If you know a layoff is coming and it had to do with business needs or not, but it's not something that is going to change. We've run all of the numbers. This is the decision made. That anxiety of what's coming, knowing that those are never nice conversations to have. Nobody's happy, especially when you're caught by surprise. You're expecting tears, you're expecting anger. And what's really important for us as HR professionals, knowing that that's coming down the line, is having support from those within our level or above, the people who we have been working on these projects with before we then have to inform everybody else.
I think that is the key component in all of this, because oftentimes, or sometimes in my experience, we don't have the support of those people, and they might be the people that are contributing to the toxic work environment.
Yeah.
So it just puts us in a really uncomfortable and stressful position,
Mm-hmm.
especially when
Absolutely.
it's our boss or our boss's boss.
Yes, definitely. And sometimes in larger companies where you have a full HR department, that can be super beneficial to be able to lean on other HR professionals. I unfortunately have never experienced that. My entire career has been HR department of one. So yeah, relying on other people and trying to make sure that I am recognizing when they are having a tough time and supporting them, to show an example of what that looks like, to be like, hey, I need this too.
Employee relations is a crucial component of HR leadership and the literal culture of our workplaces. It depends on a positive employee experience. Consultants see a lot of what's going on behind closed doors and behind the scenes in our conversations with employees and employee company leadership. So we're thinking about happiness and unhappiness, honestly, but many of us are out there facing toxicity in workplace cultures, and we need support and experience. So as an HR leader, we need to know what we need to do and how we can do it, and what we can expect for our company stakeholders. I love this conversation. Having some insight into the very worst case scenarios can help us gain experience, which is why I appreciate Naomi so much on the podcast. I believe it's our responsibility as HR experts to share what we know in spaces and places like this one. HR consulting is so much more than training, it's handholding, it's educating, it's communicating, structured learning systems, advising, and consulting. And I have learned so much from HR consultants here on this podcast series and in my own career. I do appreciate Naomi for sharing her expertise and experience with us today on the podcast. Comment podcast on the pinned post over on my Instagram account. It's at Workology Blog, where you can ask questions, leave comments, and make suggestions for future guests. I do want to hear from you. I want to thank you for joining the Workology podcast, sponsored by Upskill HR. The full hour-long podcast interview. Yes, my conversation with Naomi was actually an hour long. You can listen to it and see it in its entirety. It's available for Upskill HR members. We have over 100 hours of professional and personal development with webcasts, podcasts, videos, and interviews like this one. And they're all pre-approved for SHRM and HRCI recertification credits and PDCs. Head on over to upskillhr.com to sign up and join Upskill HR. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. My name is Jessica Miller-Merrell. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our other Workology podcast episodes. Have a great day.